Hi, I'm MC Keegan-Ayer from the Frederick County Council of Frederick County, Maryland. I'd like to welcome you to the Maryland Association of Counties Conduit Street Podcast, featuring in-depth interviews and discussions with state and county leaders on the issues and policies that affect us all.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here today with Michael Sanderson and Dominic Butchko. As we head into the 2026 General Assembly session, counties face a familiar challenge, but with sharper edges. Rising costs, tight budgets, big expectations, and a political environment shaped by a new speaker, an election year, and growing uncertainty coming out of Washington. If there's one theme that cuts across nearly everything we expect to see this session, it is affordability. Not just housing, but schools, energy, and the everyday costs that hit county budgets and residents at the same time. So today on the Conduit Street Podcast, we're going to walk through what counties should expect, how these issues connect, and why this session feels so different. Michael, let me start with budget and affordability because that really sits underneath everything else.
Yeah, it typically does under any circumstances like the one we're facing. Like, we've covered on the Conduit Street blog and on this podcast, and everybody reading the newspapers knows that the state has a bit of instability in the state budget. We've got a number to solve. It's $1.5 billion or thereabouts. So I think the budget circumstance tends to drive the tone in Annapolis, even if you're not really focused on fiscal issues. It just sort of sets the tone for how ambitious you can be, for lack of a better term. But I think when you zoom out, a lot of this conversation is on sort of affordability generally. And it's, does the state have the resources to live up to its ambitious things that we want to do in education and in serving Marylanders who are in need, and a laundry list of different policy goals? How much of that is affordable, and how do you find the means to pull that together, I think is a broad overarching challenge. Yeah,
I was just going to say, to build on that, I think this is going to be like the James Carville session where it's about the economy, stupid. I think even drilling down more, Michael, when we're talking about can the state afford this priority or that priority, a big focus is going to be, what are the cost of groceries? What are the cost of education? What are the cost of housing and utility bills? Yep. This is shaping up to be we talked about session of energy, session of housing, the past session of education. 2026 will be the session of affordability, full stop.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair diagnosis. That's the common theme that runs through almost all these top line issues. So, the reality is there's a number of components of the American economy. This is not unique to Maryland, but in the American economy, there's a number of areas where we've seen costs going up rapidly and pressures that are more than just the generic market. We're all used to thinking about, well, what's the rate of inflation, the CPI, or the sort of market basket of goods that a typical consumer buys over the course of a year. And that's a good measure generally, but it doesn't tell you the whole story if you're trying to hire a bus driver, or if you're trying to build a school or build a new apartment building. There are some facets of the economy that have really had costs rising faster than the rest of the economy, and as a result, rising faster than government revenues, which mostly are connected to the economy of right now. So I think the state and our member county governments are feeling that pressure really directly right now. I think that is kind of the main through line through this whole legislative session. It's an election year, it's a tricky budget year, but really the stuff all comes back to affordability is a challenge in a lot of ways.
Right. So that gap between rising costs and available resources across the board defines this session more than any other single policy fight. And I think it's important to point out, before you get into any new policy proposals, any new ideas, we have this giant red flashing light, which is affordability, that is before every lawmaker coming into Annapolis for the 2026 session. Dom, I want to get into a little bit of housing and energy. We talked about that a little bit. We know these are two giant issues that are going to be before us this next session. These two issues keep coming up together. How do you see the General Assembly fitting energy and housing into this whole affordability picture, and why are they so connected at this point?
Yeah, so these are just two issues that keep coming back before the General Assembly, and probably over the medium to long term, they're going to stay because they're really foundational core issues to how the state functions. So the comptroller did an excellent report over this interim, and I really like the way that the comptroller dug into the numbers and framed the housing issue in particular. And it's not just about production, but it's about affordability. And they were comparing in the comptroller's report. I found this very interesting. The cost of production in Texas, for example, and the cost of production in Maryland for the same unit. And because of regulation and because of just how we prioritize things, the cost of production in Texas is a lot smaller. And so I think on both housing and energy in particular, we're going to have to really sit down and have deep conversations of, if this is the session of affordability, what are we going to prioritize versus what aren't we going to prioritize? And it's not just unique to those two issues because this bleeds into other stuff as well. School construction, we know the costs are going up there, and that has to do with materials, labor, interest rates, fuel. And so, these factors that Michael pointed out before aren't unique to Maryland, they're nationwide, but they're really bleeding into everything. And the hard part for policymakers is, yes, Annapolis controls some of the levers, but Annapolis doesn't control all of the levers. And some of them we are really beholden to either the free market or the federal government. And in the environment we're in right now, both of those can go either way, regardless of the great policies we enact here in the next 90 days.
Yeah, I think that point right there is one that is maybe coming into focus for more and more policy leaders. That if you're a Maryland state senator and you hold a town hall meeting in your district, or you're online or whatever, and you're talking to stakeholders in your district, in your community, and asking what they're concerned about, and when they're saying things like, "I'm worried about my electric bill," it's a really weird spot to be in because you want to serve and represent and advocate for your residents back in your community. And increasingly, a number of these issues are really outcomes of the larger economy and not exactly an easy target for a state legislature, right? We saw last year energy focused legislation become a big part of what the General Assembly wanted to accomplish. And they did a couple of things. They, as I understand it, like sort of liquidated some funding that was energy related and turned it into, let's give consumer user ratepayer rebates to try and offset these pressures in the electric market. But that doesn't resolve this overall trend. If rates are going up for all sorts of reasons that are kind of multi-state, national, and bigger than all of us, it puts a state legislature in a tough spot to say, I want to respond to this, but there's only so much we can do. We saw the governor doing an executive order trying to talk about energy policy. And again, it's got a bunch of moving parts that the state government can control, but I don't think anybody's under the illusion that the state government really controls the market for electricity. And it's just a weird posture to be in as a political leader trying to serve your residents, your neighbors, when it feels like, wow, this is like above my pay grade.
I want to break that down further, actually, and let's break down what Annapolis is facing right now in terms of energy. So at the very real level from constituents, they're hearing energy bills are going up. You have to do something about energy bills. And what's the biggest contributor right now to energy bills going up in our multi-state region? It's the growth of data centers. It's the growth of AI. What's driving the U.S. economy right now? If you look at where the most growth is, if you look at where the most growth is in the stock market, it's all from AI. And Maryland in particular, we're looking at negative economic implications, not only from energy, but then aside from that totally, we also have the federal government and what's going on with jobs there. And those are mostly high paying jobs. And so you have a situation where, well, are we going to are we going to put stricter requirements on data centers, one of the biggest things growing the economy right now, when we already have economic headwinds? But if we don't tackle our energy policy and energy bills continue to go up, our constituents are going to suffer. And so it's this weird mess of, even though we have levers to pull, everything is interconnected and there's no easy solution. And it's just one of those crazy things that, I'm very happy I'm not on E&T this year because I don't want to be the one to have to, solve that puzzle.
Right. And let me play a little devil's advocate, Dom, for what you just said, because I think this is going to be the other side of what folks hear the next session, which is, yeah, part of it is, PJM, this mysterious entity that lies above states and makes these decisions. But part of it is the policy decisions that Maryland has made over recent years. And you'll hear from some folks, well, you don't see these problems in Pennsylvania or in Virginia with energy prices. We see it in Maryland, and we're unique. And that's because of the energy policy decisions that the state has made. So you'll hear that as well from the other side, Dom. And I guess, I think that there's probably a mix of the two, right? That we know that there are market forces at play, but also we know that policy choices matter. So when you look at that, Dom, how much pressure do you expect to be on the legislature to undo some of the decisions that they've made over recent years that some folks say drove up energy prices?
So I think we have to kind of parse that in a few different ways. So first, like what's going on with other states and what's going on with other state energy bills. So I think everyone knows I'm from Pennsylvania. I grew up there. I was just there for Christmas, and like my family still lives there. I can tell you in Pennsylvania, their energy costs are doubling. So it's not like Maryland is unique in that situation. Across the entire PJM region, because of how we do energy, it is regional. The costs aren't rising as fast, but they are rising region-wide in a way that's really impacting everybody. But in terms of, Maryland's energy policy and, favoring, certain forms of generation, primarily fossil fuels and traditional energy versus, more newer types of energy, and where the General Assembly will sit there, I think it's an interesting question because historically, let's say the General Assembly made it harder to develop fossil fuel in Maryland. Okay. But in order to put those new facilities up now, that's going to be years out versus solar. You can roll that out relatively quickly, relatively cheaply comparative to the other sources. And so this question of, well, is the General Assembly going to roll back natural gas regulations and all this other stuff? If they're looking to meet demand immediately, some of the more renewable sources get there quicker. But again, the economics are weird because there's so much uncertainty at the federal government. Before that stuff for years was subsidized heavily. Those subsidies are going away. I don't think there's any clear answer for anybody.
Right. And nuclear is coming, right, Dom? But remind people, what is the issue with that technology and how far out are we from seeing nuclear as a potential option to rectify this energy mess that we're in now?
No, nuclear is not tomorrow. Nuclear is at least 10 years out. And when we're talking about nuclear, I think it's just important to kind of clarify there. We're not talking about like the Homer Simpson, big uranium and the smokestacks and everything. We're talking about, modern technology. You'll hear the term thrown around SMNRs or small modular nuclear reactors. These are much smaller, several megawatts, not hundreds of megawatts that can be theoretically easily stood up and you can turn it on and off and there's all these great benefits. The problem is the technology is so new and the manufacturing is so niche, it's difficult to get these. And most of these right now are being manufactured in Europe. And so put tariffs on top of that now and a nuclear future, while it's promising, it looks like it's a little further and further away.
The context for all this stuff, though, is even as we're properly focused on the Maryland General Assembly and state of Maryland policy and how it affects the member counties of MACo and so forth, right? But these policy issues, we've already made these allusions. They don't respect state lines or county lines, right? So it's not as though what's going to determine electric rates in the state of Maryland is what we do with data centers, right? If Maryland decides we're just so worried that data centers are going to be huge consumers of water and power that we don't want them. Let's say that happens. That doesn't mean they're not going to get built. They just won't be built here. They're going to be built in Virginia and West Virginia and Pennsylvania and all around us. And the effect on the market for electricity will be the same. We just won't have those centers in the state, right? So it's like this isn't as simple as flipping a switch and saving everybody money. This is a bigger issue than that. It's part of what makes this complicated.
Well, and not
Yeah.
only that, but if you think about it, the data centers to some extent do bring an economic benefit, especially to the local jurisdictions because the tax revenue is so high. And so if you're going to be dealing with those other impacts, as a policymaker, it's a really hard decision because those data centers are probably going in this region anyway. And so do you just say, well, bring some of the negative implications here and we're going to take the tax revenue? And if you say no to that, you're still going to get the negative implications. They're just going to go to Virginia or West Virginia or even Pennsylvania now.
We could talk about data centers all day. I'll give a shout out to Frederick County. We had a big conversation at the MACo Winter Conference, and I think Frederick has been very thoughtful. They've brought in all the right people. They've brought in all sides and brought people to the table to figure out the balance because there is a balance, and we know that. And I think they're the first ones really, undertaking a big project like this in Maryland. So all eyes are on Frederick, and I think they've done a really good job so far. Of course, it's complicated, but this is obviously a huge conversation. Michael, also another huge conversation and a big piece of the puzzle to this next session is going to be federal exposure and uncertainty. We've talked a lot about the federal government and, Congress and what they've done and the various packages, the OB3, right, and how that affects states and counties. But what we hear a lot about, Michael, is Maryland's reliance on the federal government and that we don't have enough private sector involvement in our economy. We're too reliant on the feds. And we just saw a new analysis showing that roughly 25,000 Maryland workers affected by federal layoffs or instability, I think just in the month of October. So obviously, Maryland, we know, is uniquely affected by decisions made in Washington. We're the most affected when it comes to federal workforce. So Michael, that number is going to come up a lot this session. This narrative about Maryland being too connected to the feds is going to come up a lot this session. What is your read there, and what can we do in terms of responding to all this chaos in DC?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's multiple pieces of this pie, I think, and there's a number of pieces that like combine to be maybe the right way to think about this. I mean, 25,000 Marylanders losing their job is a big number. We have 6 million and change residents in Maryland, but 25,000 jobs, and by and large, these would be good paying professional jobs. I mean, not everybody is a GS12 making $1.15, but a lot of them are, right? And so even if some of those folks lost a good professional sort of career path with the federal government, and they've had to settle for something else, but if folks are now making 70 instead of a 115,000, like that's a big long-term impact on the Maryland economy that you wouldn't feel in the traditional ways. Those people aren't standing on the unemployment line necessarily. They're not collecting unemployment benefits. Some probably are, but to the extent that some people have settled for something new that might be a tier or three below where they were, that could be one of the answers to why are our revenues like almost recession level while the overall market indicators aren't. So I think that's part of what's going on. That's a meaningful number. On that longer term political question, I mean, it's not like there was ever a day when Maryland leaders said, let's go close down Bethlehem Steel so we can go all in on federal government employment. We want a federal prison. Right. Yeah. Right. Are you going to say no if the feds say, well, let's locate the headquarters for the Social Security Department or agency in Maryland and in Baltimore County? Are you going to say no? That's just tempting us to become reliant on these good, high-paying, stable jobs. Right. Nobody would do that. Nobody would say no to that. So I don't think there was ever a bad strategy. It's just we've been winners for a long time by being close to DC and having them as an anchor of stability in our economy, and we're suffering the relatively unusual. Now it feels like a liability because it's in the midst of whatever downsizing, right sizing, whatever you want to call it, and so we're feeling some outsized effect of that. But I don't think this is just desserts in any realistic way.
Right. Well, and one thing, I mean, we know these are real people, losing their jobs, and that's awful. But counties absolutely feel the downstream effects, right? We saw this and we see this during government shutdowns. When the federal government stops or when they pause services in DC, or there's something goes into litigation, county services don't stop, right? We're the ones who fill in the gaps. We're the ones who have to show up and actually do the work. So this instability in DC, I don't think a lot of people think of it as, oh, well, actually, we should think about the counties and the local governments, but really, all of this stuff flows downhill, and the counties are ultimately the backstop when those services in DC stop. So it's awkward, I think, sometimes to talk about, well, raise our hands, us too, us too. But the reality is, when people lose their jobs like this, they're showing up and they're relying on county services to help fill the gap until they can get to the next thing. And that is a big part of this conversation. We certainly feel those effects, not just in revenues, but also in these services that we provide every day. And just that general instability, because we're so close to DC, people are worried generally. So I think that's an important point to make, but it can be an awkward one, Michael, when we talk about the effects on counties, when you're actually talking about like real people losing their jobs, right?
Totally agreed. There's a human element here that's first, and then it sort of fits in the policy debate of, how much of this is predictable, how much of this is permanent when you're trying to make plans for a tough budget for this year and beyond. So both levels of that matter. But I think you framed that the right way. We've got a lot of people in our community where the family is undergoing a major adjustment because of stuff that happened through federal decision making, for sure.
If I could just pile on to that for a second too, really quick. The one thing that you guys haven't touched on that I think is really important and missing from the local government conversation, if we think of, especially since the New Deal, how the federal government has been structured, they've been structured to get policy outcomes by either, sticks or carrots. And so a lot of the policy outcomes that the federal government wants to see, they go forth and get those by grants, by different funding, et cetera. And so really at the local level, when we're implementing policy, a lot of that is subsidized through grants. A lot of that makes up our budget. And so in addition to, the jobs question, in addition to this question of, employment and everything else, whether you're in Maryland or whether you're in Massachusetts or Minnesota or wherever you are, Idaho, the share of money that we're getting from the federal government just to run everyday operations, just to implement the policies that previously they were saying were a priority, is also drying up. And so it's almost like in Maryland, we're getting a double whammy here, where we have the employment side where we were normally getting tax revenue, but then also just the general everyday help that we've been getting for decades is also drying up.
Maryland is the most affected by this stuff in DC. And Dom, don't even get me started on emergency management. You're exactly right.
Exactly.
When we talk about, money that has traditionally flowed and for really important things like emergency management, like preparing for disasters and helping people when there's a flood, all that stuff stopped. So I can talk about emergency management all day. Please don't get me started on that. That's also going to be a big conversation in the next session, but you're absolutely right. That's just another whammy on top. And layer onto all of this that we're going into an election. So this is a weird session to begin with. Michael, I want to get your perspective quickly on new House leadership, new structure in the House. And then I also want to talk about redistricting, which is really not our lane, but that certainly can affect the session because it could take a lot of time. We don't know what's going to happen there. But Michael, first, I want to get your perception. You've been here for a long time. You've seen not too many speaker changes because we had Speaker Bush for so long.
Right.
But it's not just a new speaker, it's a new structure in the House.
Yeah, multiple moving parts here. So I would say, first of all, it's an election year, and you start the conversation with every election year, recognizing that probably narrows the bandwidth of the deliberative bodies, that whether you like it or not, the political process, re-election and like getting the ticket lined up back home and other things like that, they will just draw some of the energy and attention from policymakers. So we built this process. This is the way it works. Whether you like it or not, that's just the nature of things, that the election year is different. And it ends up being usually a lower consequence legislative forum because of the added focus of the electoral process. Having the House of Delegates with a new leadership structure, we've already spoken and written about the new speaker. I think Speaker Pena-Melnick will have a different vision for the body, for the House of Delegates. Most outsiders underappreciate how important the role of the speaker is in helping to point the direction of the large body. I think there's like a group dynamic, PhD thesis to be had there about why this is important and inevitable. But speaker matters an awful lot, and a new speaker and now a new construction of standing committees where bills are going to get their hearings and so forth, and a whole wave of new leaders on the first and second tier of leadership in the House of Delegates. This is another really big variable in a legislative session that was already going to be a quirky one because of an election year and a tough budget. So like the layers in this cake are starting to add up pretty quickly. I would say for stakeholders like MACo, like we show up and have our say in every standing committee in the General Assembly. We're everywhere. Just we're affected by so many different proposals. It's our nature to show up everywhere. It's going to be really tough to sort of get up to speed on the leadership style of new committee chairs and the way things are going to run and the vibe and the feel in these different places where they're holding their public hearings. They want to get input from all the important stakeholders and from residents and so forth. This is just, it's a lot of things happening at once. It's I don't know, one battle after another, maybe.
Right. And Dom, if you're a legislator, if you're a delegate and let's say you pre-filed a bill, so you were ahead of the game, you had your bill ready to go, you submitted it, and then the bomb drops, right? And you have a new standing committee, plus you have a lot of committee policy jurisdictions changing, right? So the bill that you drafted for the committee that you're on, and you're going to be the sponsor and you're on the right committee, all that could just go out the window, right? There's been a lot of changes there too, Dom, and a lot of people around town trying to figure out how this is all going to work.
Oh, 100%. And I think a perfect example is all of the work that we've done on housing over the interim and our Bambi Act. We were operating under the assumption this is going to go to environment and transportation. E&T has had land use and housing for decades now. And that all of a sudden just totally switched. And so in the Economic Matters Committee, ECM and Environment and Transportation flipped kind of major jurisdictions. Housing and land use now lives in ECM. Energy now lives in Environment and Transportation. We have an entirely new committee now that deals with labor and local government issues kind of separate from that. And so if you're one of these folks who, if you're like me, you're the straight A student, you're doing all your homework early, you're crossing off everything on your list. Well, now everything is just up in the air. I think what's interesting for those who follow this really deeply, especially on the advocacy side, normally you have two different types of strategies. You have offensive and you have defensive. We're going to put legislation in, we're going to try and pass it, or we're going to try and stop legislation or amend it. Either strategy right now, if you're deep in this game, is just totally shifted because the musical chairs has just shifted so much. The leadership in the new ECM committee is going to be very different. Land use, for example, has a very different chair as well. So, and I think we're going to see that in the new committee. It's an interesting time to be in this game and see how it's going to be reset.
Absolutely. And Michael, I mentioned redistricting. Will it happen? Won't it happen? It's not our bag. It's been an interesting issue to follow along and watch both sides back and forth, but it will matter for counties. We are affected by it in the session. Tell us why.
I think it's just one more, I don't know, I made the analogy of a cake. It's one more layer in the cake, and it's back to bandwidth. It's not all that often we see a high profile issue like this where we have leadership in the same party with pretty differing points of view. We've seen the president of the Maryland Senate be pretty skeptical about a plan to redraw the state's congressional districts. And there's a whole bunch of backstory here that's not really Conduit Street fair, but generally speaking, this is a federal issue about the control and the composition of the U.S. House of Representatives, and various states saying, let's go out of cycle, redraw districts because some other state did that. And we have Texas, California, and other states, lining up saying, can we squeeze one seat here? Can we squeeze two seats there? Whatever that story is about and that sort of stuff is not our game, but if this ends up occupying the time and attention of legislative leaders in Annapolis for a fourth of this 90-day session, that's consequential for anything you want to get done. I mean, if we are stuck on the floor of the Senate with a tricky vote on some congressional redistricting map, and we're waiting to see who's going to file by a February deadline, like that could turn into a political issue that has sort of tentacles that affect other things that you really want. If you're desperate to get the big housing bill passed this year, or you have some environmental legislation or labor related legislation that you prioritize this year, and it's going to take some work and some fighting, the last thing you want to see is some side issue take up a lot of time and effort and oxygen and leave less of those things for the thing that you thought was going to be front and center. This could be like the new star of the show, and it has ripple effects on everything. Even if you don't really care too much about the congressional districts, you may care about the functioning of the General Assembly process, and this is another asterisk.
I think bandwidth is the perfect word there.
Yeah.
And one more thing on this being an election year, and you mentioned earlier, Michael, the legislature works the way it does, take it or leave it. Some people like it, some people don't. But when you are coming into, with all the things we just talked about, right? Everything is harder because of everything we talked about in this episode. It's also an election year, though. And so if you're in the legislature, you kind of have a list, right? Everybody needs something. So the environmentalists need something. You need something for the good government people over here. You need something for the teachers. You need something for the counties. How much harder does this become now? Again, you're going into an election year. Everybody wants to go back home and cut ribbons, and they want their apple on the ballot, all these things, right? But they have to be able to come home and say, we did things. In this kind of fiscal environment and with all the other external pressures, how much more difficult does it become, Michael, to keep that scorecard, healthy and the way you want it to look at the end of session, where, all the different stakeholders got their thing and everybody can go home and they can talk to their constituents about the work they're doing and they can get reelected? How much harder does that become with all the problems and pressures that the state's facing right now?
I mean, you basically answered your question. Right. I mean, it's just like, this is tough. This is going to be difficult for everybody. And the mentality of an individual legislator who is like, I'm trying to work on these several issues that are in my committee. And I'm trying to help get that stuff right. And I have my own bills that I'm introducing, trying to respond to things back in the community. And I want to stay in good stead with groups that I share my values with. So I'm worried about whatever, the environmental community or whomever it might be. So I'm trying to get a bunch of things done. And like, if all of this stuff is blurry and it's all kind of in a blender and it gets hurried, you end up seeing this topic has to wait, even though we generally think we want to fix it. We can't quite work it out this year. Right. Or we would put this to a task force, but this is not a good summer to spend time in a meeting at a task force. You'd rather be out knocking on doors and working for your own reelection or for the election of somebody who shares your values or somebody who's on your ticket or whatever. All of this stuff just gets harder at every level. So, buckle up. This is going to be a heck of a season ahead.
Really quick, like kind of building off of that and like predictability and everything else. One of the things that I'm going to be looking for this session, and I'm very curious, it's an election year. Everybody wants a win. Normally, at this time of year, it's all right, I think we're close to a compromise, but, we'll fight it out in committee or subcommittee and let the chips fall where they may. But with all of the uncertainty and with the importance of coming with some wins on the board for everybody, I wonder if we're going to see actually more compromise because people are going to be erring on the safe side. And I'm curious to see, as the committee hearings roll out and everything else, are we going to be seeing more people at the table saying, listen, we worked this out. You don't even need to think about this bill. All the externalities are taken care of. Or is it going to be status quo and, people are going to be duking it out like they do in a normal legislative session? I would imagine it would be more compromise, and I know we're leaning more towards that. I'm curious what other folks in town are thinking, though, and if they're thinking about that at all.
Yeah, that's a good point, Dom. I mean, a committee loves when all the stakeholders come together and bring them a finished product and everyone is signed off, and it makes it easier and they don't have to work on it. So I think that's a good point. You may see more of that just because the bandwidth is so limited and folks understand that. So really, really good point. But at the end of the day, we talked a lot about bandwidth, and when you put the rest of it, on top, budget pressures, housing and energy costs, all the uncertainty in Washington, inflation pressures that people are dealing with every single day. Go to the grocery store, you know that things are more expensive, and we have an election year calendar. It's really shaping up to be the session of affordability, and again, I'll add to that, bandwidth. So Michael and Dom, thanks for walking through all this. I know we've spent a pretty good amount of time, but I do think it's worth it. So make sure you're following along with the Conduit Street podcast, and make sure you're plugged in to MACo's social media channels, including Facebook and Twitter. Also, the Conduit Street blog, we have a number of issue previews on the blog. Please go there and take a look at those. They're really well done. And of course, you can always reach out to anyone at MACo anytime. We're going to leave it there for today. For Michael Sanderson, Dominic Butchko, and for our esteemed producer, Chantel Malcolm Lim, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.